In the rest of the order was to reduce the cost of living. I forget the other three. But there was 5 points that he made that it was his policy.
Anything about expansion into the West Bank?
Oh, reducing housing costs.
Ah, okay.
And you can take that any way you like.
Right.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome back for number 2 in our series of Judaism and Science, Is There a Conflict? So we left off last week with a couple of major questions. We discussed that there were some conflicts throughout history in regards to the world having a beginning, in regards to time having a beginning, in regards to the determination of gender. And we saw in regards to those examples that the Torah perspective based on Talmudic literature, although for many years, sometimes thousands of years, was viewed to be backwards or primitive, based on science evolving, we're able to see that indeed there was no conflict. And we left off, however, though, that's a beautiful ending. But there are many questions that have to be addressed. Based on the modern scientific theory, the age of the universe is, anybody know what the scientific community considers the age of the universe as of now?
15 billion years.
About 15 billion years old. Some say 13.7 billions and billions of years old. Let's say around 15 billion years old. The Torah perspective, when you read the first chapter of Genesis. Good evening. Good evening.
A rather great class now. The representation.
When you read the first chapter of Genesis, it strikes you as something very different than 15 billion years. If you do the math, it sounds more like 6,000 years. To be more accurate, the Jewish calendar this year is 5,773 years. So that's a conflict. How did we resolve that? We mentioned as well last time that there's a lot of evidence. Besides using high-tech scientific information in regards to being able to measure the universe and have a pretty good estimate in regards to how old it is, we also have the fossil record. We have carbon dating, which although it might have flaws, but it makes sense to go with it. It seems pretty accurate. And all these things indicate that there was life even on our own planet millions and millions of years ago. The dinosaurs were hundreds of millions of years ago. So how do we resolve that conflict? The question is clearly based on a literal understanding or interpretation of the Torah. You read the book of Genesis, the literal translation seems to be in conflict. Do we interpret the Torah literally, or are we more liberal perhaps and interpret things metaphorically? What would you assume?
Except for discussion.
Okay, it's always a fair, safe answer.
It has to be literal.
Has to be literal. You're a purist.
Well, yeah, if we're talking about Torah, it's not up for dispute, right?
So it's far from Shakespeare. Right? Shakespeare is something, you read the line and then you could sit back and discuss and philosophize and conjecture. Torah we view as much more concrete than Shakespeare. Is it literal? Does everything have to be taken literal? The answer is yes and no. The general answer is yes. We assume what it says and what is pretty much what it means. Unless we have an exception, namely if we have an authentic source telling us otherwise. So I'll give you an example. The Ramban, Nachmanides, we mentioned him last week, he writes in his commentary on the Torah that the first many chapters of Genesis are pretty much unreadable in their literal translation, referring to the creation of the universe, referring to the whole episode with Noah and the Ark, referring to the episode of the Tower of Babel. All of these things, writes the Ramban, you can't just open the book and read the verses and think you really know what's going on. There's a lot more than meets the eye. So that's clear. It's clear from the Talmud as well. The Talmud refers to knowing the sequence of creation as knowing the secrets of creation. It's a secret. Although the Torah tells you what happened, it's not really telling you what happened. It's giving you some kind of basic overview. So to answer the question, do we look at things literally or metaphorically, the answer is in general, things are to be taken literal, unless we have an ancient source or an authentic source telling us otherwise. So in this case, we do have the Ramban, we do have the Talmud telling us that it's not to be taken in its most literal sense. Okay, therefore what? So you can't read it at face value. Okay, I won't read it at face value. So there's one of two options. Therefore, one could say, let's sit back with our cigars and let's make up something really interesting. Or we could sit back and say, listen, I'm aware of the theory of relativity. I'm aware of the modern scientific community's take on how old the universe is. Let's try to take this knowledge and fit it into the verses. Does that sound like a true approach to you? No. No. Because what you're doing is you're creating your own ideas. It's good to be creative. And it's good to try to understand how modern science fits with Torah. But the answer of just making things fit, of going outside in, so to speak, is very dangerous. Because who says that has any credibility? Ultimately, you're making it up. The way, I think, to go about doing it is, once you know it's metaphorical, and that means we can't get it on a superficial level, the next step is, okay, let's delve into our ancient sources, the sources who were around before any of the scientific information was around, and let's see what they say. Let's see how they interpret the Torah. We know they're not being biased, they're not being motivated by trying to make it fit with modern science. When they wrote whatever they wrote, it was before modern science was around. That would be more of an authentic, credible way, so to speak, of decoding what the Torah is telling us. One approach that some people take is, they ask the following question. When was the sun created? What day? Anybody know? Day 4. Day 4 of the 6 days of creation was the creation of celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars. How do we measure a day? The rotation. Right? Earth spins around one time. We have an episode where it's light, where it's dark, 24 hours. That's a day. So people ask, how in the world do you have a day? The Torah's language is, there was evening, there was morning, one day. How do you have that if there's no sun? Good question. Therefore, some suggest that at least the first 4 days of creation don't really mean day in the 24-hour sense, in the literal sense. It can mean a period of time. There's no other word in Hebrew necessarily to say it was a period of time, but yom means there is a period of darkness, perhaps that's referring to chaos. There is a period of light, which is perhaps referring to things coming together. But maybe those at least first 4 days could be millions or even billions of years. So with that kind of approach, it's intriguing, it's interesting. The problem with that is, where do we find that stated in the earlier sources? We don't. You're not going to find anybody saying that really before we knew that the earth and the universe is a lot older than the Torah seems to say it is. So taking that approach by and large is really working backwards. That's doing what we want to avoid doing. That's working outside in, trying to interpret things based on our present knowledge. To be honest, there is one source that the Rabbeinu Bachaya, one of the great Rishonim, one of the great commentators in the 13th century, he quotes a source that seems to say that maybe the days of the 6 days of creation are not literally days, and he rejects it. So the only source we have of someone quoting this idea of a day being more than 24 hours is rejected. Gerald Schroeder, you heard the name before, brilliant physicist, many books out on this topic of the age of the universe, and he takes a very interesting approach. What he does is, using Einstein's theory of relativity, he shows, in his brilliance, that you could have 6 days here on Earth, each day consisting of 24 hours, But from the viewpoint of the center of the universe, that could be 15 billion years. Once again, although it's brilliant, we don't find sources that tell us this. It could be true, right? The fact that there's no proof doesn't mean it's not true. But in regards to us really feeling comfortable with something, really feeling that this has that smack of authenticity, it's hard to say. It could be true, but there's no earlier sources that seem to say that. Therefore, the approach that I want to take with you is an approach that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan takes in one of his books, which I feel is more of the inside out. We're looking at the sources, trying to work backwards. The Midrash we spoke about in the history series, that was written towards the 3rd century CE. During the times of the Mishnah, slightly after, we have two very interesting midrashim that speak about the process of creation. Number one says as follows. It's quoting the verse, "It was evening and it was morning one day." The Midrash says, "This teaches us that there is an order of times before the creation mentioned in the Torah." The fact that Torah is here mentioning time, it's mentioning one day, which the Midrash seems to be assuming literally means 24 hours, and at the same time we know there is no creation of the sun, so it can't mean a day in the classic sense. So the Midrash says there's an indication here that there was actually time, there was some form of experience that took place before the creation that speaks about in the Torah. We have a different Midrash as well, very cryptic. It says, "God created worlds and destroyed them before our own." Both of these midrashim seem to be saying that before the creation that you read about, when you open up the book of Genesis, there were other things going on. Don't think that when it starts telling you the sequence of creation, this was the first experience of creation. There were other times, there were other worlds before ours. That's what the Midrash says. We have a passage in the Talmud, in Tractate Chagiga, that says there were actually hundreds upon hundreds of generations of human beings before the creation of Adam. So these sources definitely seem to be pointing at the fact that there was a lot going on before the first chapter of Genesis. What exactly was going on? We have the Sefer HaTamuna. We have here, this is number one, written by Nechunya ben Akana. This is a Kabbalistic book, and he expresses the following view. In the Torah, it speaks about the idea of Shemitah. Shemitah is that just like we have 6 days of the week, where we engage in work and we accomplish and we create, the 7th day is Shabbos. 7th day, we just appreciate creation. The same thing is true, the Torah speaks about in Parshas Bahar, in regards to our relationship with nature. It says for 6 years, you should work the land, toil, plant, harvest. For the 7th year, you have to let the land lay fallow. You can't touch it. And the rule is that the fruit, the produce that the land produces during that 7th year isn't yours. You could walk outside to your backyard, to your orchard, and take an apple and take a lemon, that's fine, but anybody else can as well. So it's a similar idea to Shabbos. On Shabbos, we take 1 day out of the week and we sit back and relax, and instead of trying to do what to change things, we appreciate the world. Same thing is true in a yearly cycle. For 6 years, we engage in work. The 7th year, we say, let things be, to reinforce the idea that whatever bounty there is, whatever blessings I'm receiving, it's not through me, it's through a higher power. Hence we have a 7-year cycle. The Torah says there's 7 cycles of these 7 years. So we have 49 years with the same cycle over and over again. 6 years working, 1 year refraining from work, 6 years working, 1 year refraining from work. 7 times 7 is 49. We have 49 years. And the 50th year is the Jubilee year. Ever wonder where that word came from? It's a strange word, Jubilee. It comes from the Hebrew word Yovel. So we have really year 49, which is the 7th year of that particular cycle, which is a restful year, so to speak, and that goes straight into year 50, which is the ultimate refraining from working, enjoying, and appreciating what God has to offer. That's the basic rule in general. Comes along the Sefer Tamuna of the Chudi ben Akana, and he says, the same thing is not only true with the days of the week, it's not only true with the cycle of years, but it's true in regards to creation as well. We learned about, in the history series, the Talmud tells us that there are 6,000 years that our world is supposed to exist. And the 7th 1,000 years, that set of 1,000 years, number 7, is supposed to be a Shabbos. It's supposed to be somewhat of a different reality. Says Rabbi Chudi ben Akana, that's the way things have been going on for thousands of years. There have been Shemitah cycles of different worlds. Our 7,000 year unit is not the first 7,000 year unit. There was one before us, and there was one before that, and there was one before that.
When's the 50th Jubilee coming up?
Ooh, good question. So it really depends what cycle we're in now. That's debatable. Comes along the Livnas HaSapir, one of the Kabbalistic works in the 13th century, and he says his interpretation of the Sefer HaTamuna, he says we're presently in the 7th cycle. Meaning to say, as each cycle goes and it evolves and progresses onward, we are the last and final cycle of this 7-cycle experience. That means that comes the 7th part of the 1,000 years, so that's the final Shemitah year, which will then go into what's corresponding to year 50, the ultimate Yovel, the ultimate Jubilee year. We're getting kind of deep, right? But we'll try to make it more practical. So says the Livnas HaSapir, because there are 7 cycles, and we're in the 7th cycle, so let's do some math, he says. How many years have there been since the beginning of everything? So if each cycle is 7,000 years, and we're in the 7th, so that means we've already been through 6 cycles. So 7 times 6 is 42. So if there's 6 cycles, each one consisting of 7,000 years, that means by the beginning of our present cycle, we've already been through 42,000 years of different worlds. 42,000 years, that would come out at the beginning of Genesis, where it speaks about the creation of Adam. That's already after 42,000 years of other creations. Now 42,000 years is interesting. It's definitely a far cry from 6,000 years, but it's nothing close to 15 billion years. Comes along Rabbi Isaac of Akko. Rabbi Isaac of Akko was a disciple of the Ramban, of Nachmanides. He was also a good friend, and he was a master Kabbalist. He was most well known for his research into the book of the Zohar. What's the Zohar? Kabbalah. The central work of Kabbalistic literature is the Zohar. When did the Zohar emerge on the scene? In the 13th century, and it was from a man named Rabbi Moshe de Leon. His claim was he was not the author. Really, the Zohar itself was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the 5 great students of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Moshe de Leon said that he's the true author of the Zohar. Some people were skeptical. Why haven't I seen it till now? You're the one who has this mysterious book. Maybe you wrote it. Everyone agreed at the time, and hundreds of years afterwards, that indeed the Zohar was a masterful work and very significant. But there was still some debate as to who was the real author. Rabbi Isaac of Akko was given the mission to investigate the case. And that's what he did. He spent a long time, a lot of effort, a lot of exploring, into trying to find out who the real author of the Zohar was. His conclusion was indeed, it was Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, not Rabbi Moshe de Leon. That's what he's most famous for. Yes?
Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what year was he from?
He was around 170 CE. He was in the era of the Tanaim, the authors of the Mishnah. Yes?
Where was this information attained from?
Oh. So Kabbalah literally means tradition. The basic idea was that everything was written down. We have the written Torah, we have the Mishnah, we have the Talmud. The one thing that was never written down, at least in a public forum, was the more mystical ideas of the Torah. Before the Zohar was written, there were still other books out there. There was the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, which is a Kabbalistic work that dates back to the 900s. There's the Sefer HaBahir. There's a lot of older Kabbalistic works, but there is not one central Kabbalistic source until the Zohar. And his claim was that just like many greats of our generation, referring to the 13th century, have certain traditions that were passed down to them from their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers in regards to some of these mystical ideas, this was my tradition. I had certain manuscripts, and these ideas go back to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai.
But were they obtained from a higher source, or just these people's thinking?
Oh, good question. Our perspective is that experience at Mount Sinai, it wasn't just receiving the written Torah, it was the written Torah with all of its depth and explanation. And that really means, practically speaking, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Zohar, everything that explains what the Torah is, we believe those ideas were from that initial connection at Mount Sinai.
For this particular universe,
Yes.
but not from the other universes.
Right. What those other universes, the other worlds were like, we'll never know. But the Torah itself was given for our particular Shemitah cycle, for our reality. So anyways, that's what he was most well known for.
How is evolution treated?
Oh, so we're going to get there. I'm going to get there soon, hopefully. We'll first just hopefully have some idea with the age of the universe, and then we'll try to approach evolution.
Evolution implies a very long time.
Right, 100%. So Rav Isaac of Akko came along, and he said, don't think when you read the words of the Sefer Tamuna, when he speaks about many different cycles, many different worlds, based on these midrashim, based on the passage of Talmud, don't think when he says cycles of thousands of years, he's referring to years the way we view it. Ever heard of dog years before?
Yeah.
So it comes along with Isaac of Akko and says there's something called God years. Very similar, just change the D and the G. What's a God year? Well, we know what a God day is. King David writes, for 1,000 years in your eyes are but one passing day. King David says to God, 1,000 years in your eyes are but one passing day. Comes along Rabbi Isaac of Akko and says, don't think that's just poetry. Don't think he's just saying beautiful ideas. He's telling you something very real. That a day, a God day from God's perspective, is 1,000 years for a human perspective. And therefore he says, let's do the math. How much would a God year be? If a God day is 1,000 years, how much would a God year be? So we take a year, which is 365 days and a quarter, times that by 1,000. So we have 365,250. That would be a God year, right? So 365,250 human years is the equivalent to one God year. Says Rabbi Isaac of Akko, what the Sefer Tamuna is telling us when he says that there were 7 different cycles, we're in the 7th cycle. There were 6 preceding us, each one having 7,000 years. Those 7,000 years were not human years, they were God years. So if there were 42,000 years, leading up to our cycle, 42,000 times a God year, 365,250, 15,340,500,000.
No, no.
Interesting. Now, if Isaac Avaco was not aware of Einstein, he wasn't aware of any of the things that we know. He wasn't saying this to fit with modern science, like we spoke about last week. Modern science was of the opinion that there was no creation, everything was always here. But based on his understanding of Torah, based on his understanding of Kabbalistic ideas, and he knows, based on King David's writing, that a year has to be viewed from God's perspective, that means the beginning of the cycle that we're in right now is after 42,000 God years, which is the equivalent of about 15 billion years. Some are of the opinion that perhaps we're out of the 7th cycle, perhaps we're in the 4th cycle. That means there have been 3 cycles up until now. So 3 times 7, 21, 21,000 years, 21,000 human years. So to make it into God years, we have to times 21,000 by 365,250. That comes out to about 7.5 billion years. So there are 2 ideas that we find in ancient sources and classic sources. One main idea really puts the age of the universe pretty much on par with what modern science assumes. The other idea is 7 billion, which is interesting. I saw a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article where somebody said that at least some people in the scientific community are perhaps rethinking the idea of 15 or 13 billion years, and somebody went as far to say maybe even 7 billion years. So who knows? Our goal here with this is not to try to prove anything. The goal is to address the question of, is there a conflict? Science is telling us the age of the universe is about 15 billion years. The Torah seems to be saying that it's 6,000 years. Based on these ancient sources, there's no discrepancy. Question?
So what's next? Since we're in this final cycle, because I understand there's a polar shift in this and that, so what's next?
So we actually had a class on this a couple of weeks ago,
Oh,
looking into the future.
oh,
So there's a lot to look forward to, hopefully.
in what way? Negative or positive?
Ultimately, it's going to be positive. Will there be some speed bumps along the way? There could be.
Well, they're here now.
There's always been speed bumps. That's very true. I want to quote you something from Rabbi Israel Lipschitz. Rabbi Israel Lipschitz wrote a very interesting essay in 1834. And in the essay, he was actually addressing some new discoveries that was happening in his time when they found fossils of massive creatures, and they were beginning to think about the fact that these don't really seem to fit with the kind of elephants that we have nowadays. There's something else going on. So perhaps one might have been afraid. One might have been, listen, maybe science is going to disprove our beliefs. You could never be afraid of truth, though. If you're afraid of pursuing truth, that means you don't really seek truth. If someone's telling you, I have a good angle, I have evidence, I have solid reasoning, so my response should always be, let me hear it. Bring it on. We're not here to deny truth. We're here to embrace truth. So he writes in an essay, see how the teachings of our Torah have been vindicated. In various places in the world, creatures have been discovered which no longer exist today. In Baltimore, they found an extremely large elephant-type creature called a mammoth. In other geographical locations, they discovered dinosaurs over 90 feet long, and obviously no such creatures exist anymore. Science is confirming that there were different life forms, that there were different worlds before our own. His perspective wasn't, oy vey, maybe they're going to disprove my beliefs. No. They're just showing that what we've believed for thousands of years, we could finally have evidence for. So we spoke about last week the idea of dinosaurs making one nervous. It shouldn't make you nervous. It should only strengthen your idea, strengthen your connection to the words of our sages. This is what they've been telling us for thousands of years. Now we finally have evidence to show that it's true. In regards to evolution, is evolution something that by definition is in conflict to Torah?
Yeah.
Well, you would say yes. Why would you say yes?
Well, evolution dictates that things happen over a long period of time where the Torah, things were created.
Okay, well, the idea of a long period of time, at least based on our information now, that's not in conflict, right? We have the sources that tell us that the universe could have been 15 billion years old. I guess there still might be a conflict, which is classic evolution, survival of the fittest, really is indicative of no plan, no controller, no program. Everything is just evolving based on the conditions in a random way. Those that are stronger survive, those that are weaker die off, hence that we have evolution. So, can we believe in evolution? The answer is yes and no. We can believe in evolution. The basic idea that things evolved, no problem believing in that. To say that things evolved randomly, just by happenstance, because this happened to be strong and therefore it reproduced more and the ones that were weaker didn't reproduce as much, that idea can be true as well, and we can even see that in nature. But we believe that everything is based on a plan. To say that part of God's plan was to create more intelligent life through this process is okay to say. Would I take an oath to say that's true? No. Maybe evolution's wrong. It's a theory. There's some good evidence for it, so maybe it's right. I think the only thing that we can't say is that it's random, it just happens to be this way. So the idea of evolution being true, we could definitely embrace.
But God also has a tendency of wiping the slate clean, because like all of a sudden these dinosaurs come up, and then God says, well, that's not exactly what I planned, so you know what, I'm going to take this asteroid, I'm going to just wipe them all out, and then he starts all over.
Which is very interesting because it's so similar to what the Midrash says, right? He created worlds and destroyed them. Dinosaurs, or at least now the common theory is, they were destroyed by a massive asteroid about 65 million years ago. I don't think, though, I wouldn't say it quite the way you said it. That God tries something and looks at it, you know what, it's just not working out the way I planned. Let me try something else. Like an artist, he paints something, he doesn't like it, he crumples it up. That's not how God works. We believe everything is part of a plan, everything is part of this evolution and developing of life.
But
why did God use that experience?
He said he evolves from like a monkey.
What's that?
That from an ape. Man is the latest stage in its evolution from an earlier primate form.
Oh.
According to the scientists.
Like what happens if we find like a Sasquatch, like the missing link between ape and human?
That'd be wonderful. The one thing that we would say is that even if you could tell me biologically speaking that our ancestor was some form of monkey, we definitely feel there's a qualitative difference between a human being and a monkey.
99% of our DNA is just like them.
What's that?
99% of our DNA is just like an ape's DNA.
100%. That's true. But that doesn't tell me qualitatively speaking in regards to our spiritual capacity, in regards to our ability to connect with the infinite. That's one thing that we believe, like we spoke about last week, once we come from the premise that there's a creation, and that creation is for a purpose, and the Torah does tell us there's something special about human beings. Now, how exactly did Adam turn into Adam? Was it through the evolutionary process? Was it through some other means? I wasn't there. But the one thing we have to say from the Torah perspective is that qualitatively speaking, we're very different than apes.
Free will.
What about it?
We had it. Nobody else had it.
You're saying this is one example of how we're different than
Yes,
the animal
free
kingdom?
will.
100%. Some might argue and say that's just because we have a more evolved brain and that causes those types of thoughts. So listen, there's a lot to debate. But from the religious perspective, we don't have to deny any of these things. The one thing that we do have to believe is that qualitatively speaking there's a massive difference. Maybe I'll bring it next week. I'll show you a science textbook that the introduction of the textbook offends me. Whatever, maybe we'll save it for next week. And I'll show you just to get a little bit of the different perspectives out there in the world. Any questions so far on the age of the universe topic?
I think it's a little bit, I don't believe that God plans everything. He's to some extent an experiment. In other words, he sets the stage and says to himself, what's going to happen? You know, all these environment and everything. So that, just to repeat myself, I think God is an experimenter.
Well, you're a scientist,
in addition to being a planner.
I hear that. I think the one point of confusion would be the Jewish perspective of God, a lot based on last week's lecture, is that God is outside time and space. We refer to God as the infinite. So that means by definition that God lacks or needs nothing. The whole idea of experimenting is really, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. Let me put a little bit of this amino acid with this protein and see what it forms. I'm only experimenting because I lack knowledge on some level. So to have that perspective in regards to the infinite creator of the universe is a little bit difficult.
But it would be too big a job to plan everything to the last detail. It's just more reasonable for God even to say, well, I've set the stage for an experiment and see what happens.
I'll quote you in the writings of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, one of the great Talmudists and Kabbalists in the 1700s. He says, if I knew God, I would be God. So I think our perspective is, it's true. We can't fathom how such a thing could happen. We can't fathom, you could think of just planning a day trip, we're planning on going away for the day tomorrow. Even thinking about what clothes to bring for the girls and the diapers, and even that's overwhelming, let alone thinking about creating an entire universe. But from the perspective of an infinite, limitless being, somehow it can be done. We're talking about math, we're discussing equations and that kind of fun stuff. Let's go to more math. I want to speak about the Jewish calendar. How does the Jewish calendar work? Anybody know?
Lunar?
It's lunar. Most people say it's lunar. Let me just pass some of this around over here.
It's both, lunar and solar.
It's both. Oh. Just take one and pass one down. The secular calendar, as we know, is a solar calendar, which is fairly simple. That means it's one entire rotation of the Earth going around the sun. That's 365 and a quarter days. The lunar calendar, what's a lunar calendar? How do you calculate that?
The rotation of the moon.
The rotation of the moon going around the Earth 12 times. Right, going around the Earth one time is 1 month.
Yeah.
Doing that 12 times makes a lunar year. How many days are there in a lunar year? What's that? Well, that's a lunar month we're going to get to. But how about the year itself?
365.
Well, 365 in the solar year, 354 days in a lunar year, 8 hours, 48 minutes, and 40 seconds, approximately. Right? So basically, there's almost 11 days discrepancy between a solar year and a lunar year. So, for example, in the Muslim culture, they have a lunar calendar, which means we don't care about the sun. That means nothing in regards to how we calculate the days. It's all about the moon. And that's why, because their calendar is only 354 days, their holidays, let's say Ramadan, for example, comes out at any point of the year. There's no season for Ramadan. The secular calendar is purely solar, and the moon is not included. The Jewish calendar is somewhat complex, surprising. Right? We have somewhat of a combination.
We just add another month from time to time.
Right, exactly. And that's how we make up for it. But we have to incorporate the solar year. We feel that the main calendar is the lunar year, but we have a commandment in the Torah. One of the mitzvos, one of the instructions of the Torah is that you must celebrate Passover in the spring. So if we just had the lunar calendar, we'd start off in the spring, but it would slowly slip into winter and it would go all throughout the year. So we add an extra month every now and again. There's a whole complicated system of every 19 years. We have 7 years where there's a leap year where we add an extra month. But the goal is to somehow connect the lunar year and the solar year in order to have Pesach, right, the holiday of Passover, come out after the vernal equinox, namely after spring, which is sometime between March 19th and March 21st. So how do we do that? there was a calendar that was created. In the olden times, the way they would declare the new moon is they would have witnesses come into the Beit Din, to the high court, and they would say, we saw the sliver of the moon, and the judges would know very well, based on their equations, where the moon should be right now, and they would test them to verify that what they were saying made sense. And based on their testimony, assuming it was valid, they would declare the new moon, and that was the beginning of the new month. Right? The word month comes from moon. However, as time went on, practically speaking, this is a very difficult system to maintain, so they created a calendar. Now, to create a calendar, which means we're not going month to month, we're going to create a system, and based on our definition of how long a lunar month is, namely how long it takes for the moon to go around the earth, we're going to create a calendar. So how long does it take for the moon to go around the earth? Bill was mentioning 28 days.
Yeah.
Is it always the same every rotation?
No.
It's not. Right? Based on the gravitational pull of the sun and how it affects the earth, the orbit of the moon could differ from hours, from one month to the next. So if you're trying to make a calendar, what you have to do is you have to find the average lunar month. Right? The average lunar month is referred to as the synodic month, which means the normal. Sometimes it's an hour more, sometimes an hour less. But if you calculate all the different time it takes for the moon to go around the earth, what's the average? Now, if you're off by 3 minutes, the calendar's destroyed. Because in 1,000 years from now, 3 minutes makes a big difference. And in trying to celebrate Passover in the spring, it's not going to work. So you have to have a very, very fine knowledge of the average month.
Is Passover the only holiday in the Torah that's mentioned to fall on a certain season?
Yeah, I mean, every holiday has a date. But in regards to the season, Passover is the one where the Torah says it has to be celebrated in the spring.
Well, what about Sukkot? Because it's the harvest, so you have to have Sukkot for the harvest.
It doesn't say in regards to Sukkot, just in regards to Pesach.
Well, if you have Pesach falling in the spring,
right,
then everything aligns.
Right, 100%. I mean, once you have that system, you're good to go. But it doesn't say explicitly in regards to Sukkot.
Pesach is early, Rosh Hashanah is going to be early.
So why is Passover so special then? That it gets a special mention.
The way the Torah phrases it is that you have to celebrate in the springtime because that's when I took you out of Egypt. And there was something special about that because you think about it for a second, you're being freed from Egypt. It's a wonderful thing. Picture yourself during the times of Martin Luther King. We just had Martin Luther King Day. And he was able to convince certain people, let's say, in a certain situation, to allow African Americans to join the white people in school. And your whole life, you've been pushed to the back of the bus. And your whole life, you've been looked at in a negative way. People spit at you once in a while. They don't let you drink from their same water fountains. And finally the day comes where there's some level of equality. How do you feel? You feel like $1 million. It's wonderful. And let's say that day where you're able to go to school with all the white children was also a beautiful spring day. Would that enhance the moment? Somewhat. I think our assumption would be I wouldn't even notice it. I'm so thrilled about just having this opportunity to learn and be normal, I wouldn't even pay attention to the small details. But the Torah is saying that when we left Egypt, it's saying don't just be appreciative of this amazing miracle of leaving slavery and becoming free people, but notice the details also. Notice the fact that it's spring. So it's a very powerful message for life. And no matter what's happening, good or bad, we shouldn't be oblivious to some of the nuances. That could be part of the reason, perhaps. So, in order to create a calendar for all future generations, you have to be able to determine the average lunar cycle. How do we do that? This is 1,500 years ago.
Scientific calculator.
Scientific calculator. You could have made lots of money back then if you had it. So I want to read to you, this is the first source we have on the page. This is a quote from the Talmud in Tractate Rosh Hashanah. This is the underlined part. Rabbi Gamliel said to them, I have it on the authority of the house of my father's father somewhat of a poor translation. The real translation should be, I have a tradition. I have a Kabbalah, I have a tradition going back to my grandfather, which many of the commentators say actually went back to Mount Sinai. This is a tradition that was passed on for generations, that the renewal of the moon takes place after not less than 29 days and a half, and 2/3 of an hour, and 73 chalakim. Make sense? Got it?
No.
Okay. So, in order to understand this, we need somewhat of a background here. It's late, but a little math is always exciting. The way that the Talmud calculates an hour, it didn't use seconds. It used chalakim. Chelek means a portion. And there were 1,080 portions in 1 hour, which basically means each portion is about 3 1/3 seconds long. So the Talmud's telling us that the average cycle of the moon, the average time it takes for the moon to go around the earth, is not less than 29 days and a half, 2/3 of an hour, and 73 parts. So what's 2/3 of an hour? If an hour is made up of 1,080 parts, what's 2/3 of 1,080?
You can tell us.
Well, have it on the board here to make it easier.
120.
What's that? What did you say?
120.
720. Very good. 720. So when the Talmud says 2/3 of an hour, that means 720 parts of an hour. Then the Talmud says, and 73 parts extra, so 720 plus 73 equals 793. Right, so 793. That means, to make it somewhat simpler, the Talmud's saying 29 and a half days, and then 793 parts of an hour. So what does that mean, practically speaking, 793 parts of an hour? Well, we do the division here. 793 divided by 1,080 will give you 0.73426. So it's 0.73426 parts of an hour. How much is this of a day? So divide 0.73426 by 24. We get the number 0.03059. So what we just did here, right, simply speaking, is we did the math that based on what the Talmud tells us, that we have 793 parts of an hour, and that is basically 0.73426 of an hour, divided by 24. How much is that of a day? It's 0.03059 of an entire day. Okay. And the Talmud's saying it's 29 and a half plus this number. That's the average lunar cycle. So we add 29 and a half to this number. Right, this number, once again, 0.03059 plus 29.5 is 29.53059. So the Talmud's telling us that the average lunar cycle is 29 and a half days, 3059. Okay, that's nice. And it was based on that calculation they were able to create the calendar for all future generations. Yes?
Where did they get this information? They didn't have slide rules and this and that. Where did they get this information?
It's a very powerful question you're asking.
Sorry.
Well, the Talmud says that it's based on the tradition that he receives from his father, that went to his grandfather, that went back to the source, namely that experience at Mount Sinai.
All that information was given down?
Or at least the ability how to calculate these things. That's what he's claiming. Now we're going to have to explore, can there be another rational way to explain how they arrived at this number? Now this number is not necessarily impressive in and of itself. What is impressive is that NASA, for 3 years, was trying to figure out the average length of the lunar cycle. And after much investigation, using the highest level technology they had in the 1960s, they arrived at the following number. They came up with 29.530588. Right? So instead of 29, 29 is the same 0.5305. The distinction is NASA is saying 88, the Talmud is saying 9.
Oh my God.
That's a difference of 0.000006 or 6/millionth of a day.
So who's right?
What's the difference?
That was in the 60s. I'm sure NASA in a couple of years will be more
Update
accurate.
it.
Will update itself. This is another good example of a conflict between
That's unbelievable.
Judaism and science. It is a conflict. But how do they have this information?
The number of significant figures is different.
Right, 100%. I mean, ultimately, it's pretty much the same exact number.
Right.
So if one rounds off, gets 9.
Right.
Right. It could very well be this is the approximation of the sages of the Talmud. So the
Wow.
question really is, I think, as you're pointing out, where did this come from? How do you have this information? And you weren't around to give them a scientific calculator. How do you calculate this?
Was there clearer channels at this time, at that time? More sages, more openness to reception of ideas?
I mean, at this time, this is in the times of the Talmud, which is going back to around the year, let's say, 400 CE. You know, they were wonderful people. Yeah, but you know, they didn't have necessarily prophecy. We spoke about in the history series. Prophecy stopped hundreds of years before that point in time. So it wasn't necessarily through supernatural means, at least in the present, when they were there writing these things down. What they claim, though, in the Talmud is that this is based on the tradition that we have, going back to the source of all truth, of all information, which is that experience in Mount Sinai.
So at what time was this calendar introduced formally? Obviously it was a tradition handed down, but nobody had written it down or formalized the calendar.
There's a man named Hillel HaKatan. We know about Hillel and Shammai. So the Hillel that we're mostly familiar with is really hundreds of years before. But in around 370, Hillel HaKatan was the one who sat down and actually made the calendar for all generations to come. I want to leave you with one other idea here. This, before we get to the next idea, I'll just share with you this equation, this number was shared with Professor Robert Newton, who was formerly an astronomer at Johns Hopkins University. Very skeptical guy. So somebody went over to him and said, "Professor,
By the way.
look in the Talmud, it happens to be, you know, it's pretty amazing. What would you respond to that?" And I quote, "I guess they were lucky." Like we said last week, Simon and Garfunkel, it always rings true. A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. We actually have in last week's Parsha, we know the last of the 10 plagues, the plague of the firstborn. So Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, "At around midnight, all of the firstborn will die." And the question is, why does he say around midnight? That's not what God told him. God told him at midnight, at that exact point in time, all of the firstborn will perish. But when Moses told Pharaoh, he said around midnight. Why did he do that? So Rashi, one of the great commentators, explains. He says because he was nervous. The astronomers, the magicians of Pharaoh, they might have their own clocks, their own systems for telling time, and they might be off by a little bit. So let's say, according to their calculation, they're looking at their sundial. I'm not sure how you do that when it's 12 o'clock at night, but they're looking at their form of telling time, and it's midnight. And looking around, no one's dying. You know what they're going to say?
You died.
Moses was a liar. Moses is a liar. He said 12 o'clock. What does he know? That's why he said around midnight. Now, if you analyze this idea, it's really profound. Let's say they would have said that. They would have said he's a liar because their watch would have been 2 minutes early. What would have happened 2 minutes later when actual midnight came?
We said our watch is wrong.
We said our watch is wrong. That should have been the normal response. But the fact that Moses was concerned that they would think he's a liar and therefore almost question God, that means he knew, his understanding of human nature was, they're probably not going to assume their watches were wrong. They're going to assume, you know what, maybe it did happen, he got lucky, maybe the firstborn somehow died, but you see he was off by 2 minutes. That's the amazing power we have as human beings to deny anything. Even after seeing open miracles, 10 plagues after the other, each one being predicted by Moses, If you're off by 2 minutes, I'm not going to say I'm wrong, you're wrong.
But yeah, midnight keeps on shifting. It's not the same as sunset to the next sunset.
Each day.
And
Right.
right in between, that must mean that's exactly midnight.
But 100%. I'm saying, but even objectively speaking, when God said it would take place at midnight, we assume God was referring to actual midnight based on whatever time of year it was. So for the astrologers of Pharaoh to assume that Moses was wrong instead of them being wrong, well, we see the same thing in our own time with Professor Robert Newton. I'll share with you one more idea, which is in regards to Halley's Comet. Ever seen Halley's Comet? I was a young boy at the time, but my father took me and my brother. We were out there in the freezing cold at night, looking up at the sky, and I was so frustrated because I remember so vividly my dad was saying, "Oh, there it is, there it is," and my brother saying, "Oh, I see it, that's unbelievable." And I'm looking up at the binoculars, I can't see it, Dad. I never saw it, I don't think. I might have seen it, but I realized very disappointing. But hopefully 70 more years, whatever it is, you know. We have an interesting passage in the Talmud where it was referring to a rabbi going on a boat, and he mentions the fact to his colleague that there's a certain comet that comes around every 70 years. And tonight is most likely the night that we're going to see it. Okay. Who was the one who discovered Halley's Comet? Any guesses?
Haley.
Halley. Edmund Halley. In the year 1682, he observed a bright comet, and he noted that it was a very similar orbit to a similar comet that took place, that was seen in 1607, and was also seen in 1531. Now, up until that time, and I quote you from a scientific textbook, prior to Halley, comets appeared at irregular intervals and were often thought to be harbearers of disaster and signs of divine wrath. Halley proved that they're actually natural phenomenons subject to the laws of gravity. Until the 1800s, the idea of having a reoccurring comet wasn't heard of. And it's hard. How do you detect something that comes around every 76 years? He predicted, though, that it would come around again 76 years. He wasn't there to see it, but when the world saw it, they realized that indeed his theory was correct. Now, another interesting example of what seems to be a conflict between science and Judaism. The Talmud is telling us 1,500 years ago that the rabbis were aware of such a phenomenon. They knew that there are certain comets that have a cycle. The Talmud says around 70 years. Do we know for sure it's referring to Halley's Comet? We don't know for sure. Very likely it was. But even if it wasn't, the idea that they had that knowledge, that itself is tremendous. So I think a lot of what these things seem to point to is to assume they were just a bunch of smart, creative individuals doesn't quite do it justice. There's a lot of information here that they were clearly privy to, and I think it requires more faith to believe that it's all coincidence. I think it requires more faith to take the position of Professor Newton to say, listen, they got lucky up to 1/6 millionth of a day. I think the more logical response would be there might be something going on. There might be more of a divine, more of a supernatural source to some of these ideas. Hopefully next week we'll explore a little bit more and hopefully come to some more conclusions. Have a wonderful evening.
Wow.
Any questions or alternative speeches?
Gosh,